Welcome, everyone. I am Justin Paperny with White Collar Advice and Prison Professors, and I'm here with my good friend and partner, Michael Santos. Before we get into the interview, what time did you get started working today, if I may ask?
3:30.
The reason I ask is because every now and again I get a call from someone who says Michael Santos's journey was easy and he met these billionaires in prison, and I will tell you that 5 or 6 years after his release, he's working just as hard as he was when I met him in prison, still waking early,
Wait a
even.
minute. I didn't hear that before. Could you repeat that?
Uh,
People said my journey easy, going through
yeah,
26 years in prison.
a
That's
few.
awesome. I love that.
I thought I texted that to you or something. Yeah, a few weeks ago, someone called and said it must be easy for guys like you, Hopwood, and Santos to reemerge from prison successfully because he went to prison meeting and associating with billionaires, and it doesn't. His story doesn't translate to the rest of us, and I just sort of listened. And I'm sorry, dude. I thought I told you that.
Well, that would be a very good lesson to teach, because anybody who thinks that has an awful lot to learn, not only about going through prison, but about preparing for success in life.
Let's transition to an email I received from a professor, from a high school teacher in Texas, I believe. Amarillo, Texas, sent us a message, Michael, that said, I teach correctional services in a high school in Amarillo, Texas. I've come across your website searching for pre-sentence report for students. Do you have access to a template you wouldn't mind sharing with us? So I responded to this teacher and said, beyond just sharing a template, perhaps I can have a conversation with Michael Santos and talk a little bit more about the importance of the pre-sentence report, share it with the students, along with our lesson plan and a template to help prepare these future potential correctional officers, etc. So, Michael, given that email, can you share with us your thoughts or the importance of, or what is the pre-sentence investigation?
Yeah, let's start by what you just said.
Yeah.
You said that if they're going to be potential correctional officers.
Mm-hmm.
The pre-sentence investigation report is available to anybody who works in the prison system. That is the document that people turn to determine classification inside of the prison system, determine what types of programs the individual may be eligible for, and it can also have an influence on when an individual is going to be released back into the community to participate in post-release programs. Now, hello there.
I need this for the kids.
Yes, you can have the airheads. Thank you. Would you please close the door on the way out? Thank you. Okay, we're just going to keep rolling. This is YouTube. Forgive me. Please continue.
So if it's for correctional officers, that's where the essence of the pre-sentence investigation comes in, is it's learning a little bit about the individual's life prior to incarceration and whether this individual qualifies for specific programs as he's going through the journey and when he gets out of the journey. Mm-hmm. The main purpose of the pre-sentence investigation report, theoretically, is to help the judge at sentencing. The judge has listened to the documentation from the prosecutor, which really focuses on the individual's crime and the individual's criminal history. So the instant offense and the previous offense, the criminal conduct of the offender. It also can and should identify some of the human characteristics of the individual. The judges rarely know what brought an individual into the criminal justice system and what propensity or what likelihood an individual has to become a contributing member of society again. And the pre-sentence investigation report can have a very influential role in helping judges understand that process.
Something you mentioned in an interview with Judge Bennett, and something that is shocking to a number of defendants, maybe shocking to these students, shocking to a number of lawyers. You asked Judge Bennett if you thought it was a good idea potentially to get a narrative that a defendant may write into the pre-sentence report. Till this day, I get so much pushback and feedback on that, primarily because a lawyer says, well, I've never done it before, so it must not make sense. Can you talk about why getting, for example, a personal narrative into a pre-sentence report could be advantageous for a defendant?
Yeah. But I think it's also important to understand the stakeholders there. And there's a reason that lawyers are sometimes resistant to bringing that narrative in. It is because most defendants haven't really processed through how their expressions and their words are going to potentially undermine the lawyer's work. The lawyer is focusing on objective facts, such as include case law, and decisions that have been made in previous courts over the past. And they have a lot of experience in working with defendants who are not always willing to accept responsibility, to identify with victims, to show what they have learned. Instead, they are trying to, all too often, they're trying to minimize their own misconduct, and that can undermine the lawyer's efforts to get a lower sentence. So lawyers are conservative by nature in that they want to protect the work that they have done. Since they can't really control what a defendant does, and reading through an extensive personal narrative, as you described it, or a person's individual journey, that takes a lot of time. It takes a lot of time, first of all, to get it out, and it takes a lot of time to assess, is this going to be helpful in the whole process? So that's one of the reasons that lawyers are resistant to introducing this document. But with regard to judges, it is the main thing that they want to know. They consider sentencing to be a very important part of their lives and their job and their responsibility as public servants. So the more they know about an individual, the more they are, the stronger they become in being able to determine what is the best possible sentence for this individual. And that is particularly true in light of the Booker decision, which happened about 10, 12 years ago in the Supreme Court, which made the federal sentencing guidelines advisory rather than mandatory. Because they are advisory, the judges will start as a basis point, using the federal sentencing guidelines as a basis point, but then they will try to learn about the defendant and take what they have learned about the defendant and determine where the sentence should fall for that particular individual.
So I have a couple questions and thoughts. You mentioned when you started talking about the pre-sentence report programs. I know 10 years ago when I met you in prison, I was reading a cool little book you wrote, a red book, What If I Go to Prison? And even back then you were writing about how the PSR can influence jobs and bunks. Why is that? And can you share some ideas on how a defendant should speak openly and honestly if it's going to influence their bunk or job, etc.? If you can get into that.
That goes to your first question or your first statement about people who are going to be correctional officers. When a person comes into the prison system, a correctional officer or somebody, a practitioner in the criminal justice system, doesn't know anything about the individual. The only thing they're going to be looking at individuals if 100 people came into the institution today. They're not going to have time to get to know every single person. Not only are they not going to have time, they're not going to take the time to listen to your story, because every one of those people are going to have one similar trait. They're all going to want the best possible experience. The case manager, those time is limited. So what they're going to do is they're going to very quickly look at that pre-sentence investigation report and make some very quick decisions. Where's that person going to sleep? Where's that person going to work? What job am I going to put this person in that both contributes to the security of the prison, but could also have other implications, such as qualifying the individual for better custody and so on like that. So the pre-sentence investigation report has a massive influence on the person's life from the correctional officer's perspective, and to the extent that an individual can influence that pre-sentence investigation report, that individual can influence his time going through the period in prison.
Yeah, let's talk about several years ago, you shared a story with me. There was a defendant who was fully expecting like a 3-year sentence. And because of that, the lawyer essentially said, just show up to the interview, tell the truth, it's going to be fine. You're going to get 3 years. You're going to go to a camp. Didn't prepare for the interview. I don't even think the lawyer went with him to the interview, which is pretty uncommon. And ultimately, the defendant was designated to a low in part because of some of the specific language in the pre-sentence report. You might have later written about it in one of our lesson plans, and there was some language regarding like corruption or RICO or ties to like mafia or stuff like that. So talk about, even if you're expecting even 18 months or a couple of years, language in the PSR can ultimately influence your designation. Can you talk about that a little bit, please?
Yeah, it all starts with recognizing that a correctional officer is frequently busy. They've got a huge caseload, and they don't take time necessarily to study all the facts of a case. They're going to rely on the bullet points of a pre-sentence investigation report. The example that you're referring to, I've written about a lot, and it's because I'm an individual in a higher security prison who could have served his time in a minimum security camp. This individual happened to be in the finance industry. I think he was in the mortgage business. Yeah. And part of the crime was that he was issuing or assisting people who had ties to organized crime in getting mortgages so that they could buy houses. Well, this individual was a mortgage broker. He wasn't in organized crime. He wasn't affiliated with organized crime, but he provided loans. He helped those people get loans. And he facilitated the fraudulent, the submission of fraudulent documentation. But that's not the same thing as being involved in organized crime and some of the violence that is associated with that.
Right.
But when somebody goes into prison and it states in there a member of a specific crime family or a gang or something like that, or does any kind of business with them, the correctional officer is going to take a very conservative approach and just look at that, and that is going to be enough to put what's called a public safety factor on an individual. So this individual who was only serving a couple of years and could have served them much easier in a minimum security camp ended up going to a higher security prison, which isn't the end of the world. There's always a way to get through, and I always advocate for an individual understanding how to prepare himself regardless of what authorities do. But this individual had to go to a higher security, and he would have liked to have gone to a minimum security where he would have had access to community custody and furloughs and some other opportunities that did not exist in higher security.
So as we wrap up this video on the PSR, knowing that potential defendants, clients, these students are watching it, what are some last minute takeaways you'd offer to these students or anyone whose goal is to learn more about the pre-sentence report as we wrap this up?
For anyone who wants to learn the basics of a pre-sentence investigation, let me just give you those very quick bullet points. It is a document that hopefully brings a little bit more understanding to the individual as a person. So the process would be that a federal or a state probation officer would meet with the individual and get the individual's version of events, learn a little bit about what the individual has to say about what brought him into the criminal justice system. That the pre-sentence investigation officer, generally a probation officer, would also interview the defendant's family members, perhaps the individual's teachers, perhaps the individual's work people with whom he has worked, and learn as much as they can about the person. That the research from that investigation will result in a report. And that report, as I think your teacher said, is going to follow a template that is going to give the objective information, what is the crime, what is the individual's criminal history, but also some subjective information, which is about the individual's influences in life. Who were his parents? What was his upbringing? What kind of environment did he grow up in? Does an individual have a history of mental illness, of substance abuse, of other factors that could have influenced or could have had an influence on the criminal behavior at hand? And all of that together is kind of like a story that the judge and then eventually the prison system will take into consideration when making assessments on this individual. As Justin suggested, we advocate that an individual should sow some seeds to influence that narrative so that he can advocate for himself better as he goes further or deeper into the journey.
Well, this is a great video. Thank you. If I understand you're going to join our our weekly call this Friday. You'll come back and join us on Friday for our coaching call?
Yeah, let's schedule that.
Let's schedule that. Thank you. All right, everyone. Thank you very much for watching this video with my mentor, partner, Michael Santos. I'll let you get on with your day, bud. Thank you very much for sharing your expertise as always.
Great. Thanks.
Nice talking to you. Okay.